Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. I'm Lydia, the Halfling Seamstress. I took a bit of time off because summers get crazy busy, but I'm back and rested, mostly, and ready with another project. Now I fully recognize the irony of releasing a video about making a Victorian bathing costume at the time of year when most people have fully made the switch over to pumpkin spice everything and sweater weather, but I made this project during the summer, and I will be darned if I don't show it off. Plus the weather, at least at the time of filming the reveal, was still warm enough that I could take a dip in the lake and not feel chilly. I am one of those people who have never been fond of modern bathing suits. I have worn them because that is what modern society deems acceptable, although pigs will fly before you ever catch me in a bikini. However, I've always loved the look of the late Victorian, early Edwardian bathing costumes. The nautical sailor look with bloomers and skirt. It's just so cute. You know, forget hot girl summer, I want time traveler summer. For this project, I'm using Folkwear pattern 253, a bathing costume from approximately 1890. The style of bathing costume tend to stay fairly similar throughout the decade and even into the start of the 1900s. Although there were a ton of individual variations on design, the bare bones of the style tends to be the same, a short-sleeved, knee-length romper with a detachable skirt. Commonly, these bathing costumes were made out of wool, but since I absolutely hate the feeling of wool against bare skin, I opted instead for a cotton twill. This will give the same kind of structure without the sensory problems. In hindsight, I wish I had opted for a slightly lighter navy, as this fabric does tend to look almost black in some lights. And in fact, I must give a heads up that if the lighting looks at all kind of janky in this video, it's because my camera did not know what to do with itself in handling this dark fabric. Bernadette Banner has mentioned before that trying to film black fabric is a nightmare, and I fully understand why now. I did a mock-up beforehand to make sure everything fit just right, and I was overall quite impressed at how close it fit to my actual measurements. I added a little bit to the front opening of the bloomers, but that was about all that needed altering. Since I'm going to be using my antique machine for most of the sewing, I wanted to mark the seam allowances before I began, since antique machines don't have the handy seam allowance markings that modern machines do. I also marked all the buttonhole placements, which is so much easier to do on a flat piece of fabric than once it's stitched up. This place also has a bit of funky stitching, so I marked that ahead too. I followed the sewing guide in the pattern pretty much word for word, and it's a reasonably straightforward pattern to use. I started with the bodice, sewing the front pieces to the back at the shoulders. The bottom edge of the bodice lining gets folded upward and pressed flat, which will enclose the raw edge. The lining is attached at the shoulders, with the right side of the lining facing the wrong side of the bodice front. It's kind of hard to explain, but the diagram in the pattern makes it easy to follow along. The seam allowance gets trimmed down to reduce bulk, and the lining gets pressed to the other side and stitched down. The bodice pieces get joined at the side seam and stitched down. The bodice also has 3 sets of pleats, 1 set on each front side and 1 set at center back. Was it a right pain in the butt to remember which pleats needed to go in which direction, with the direction changing depending on if you were looking at the right side or the wrong side of the fabric? Yeah, it kinda was. And while the front pieces get knife pleats, the center back gets kind of a double box pleat thing instead. The pleats all get pressed to, well, press the crease into place and help maintain the sharp line of the fold. One change I made is that you're supposed to leave the back pleats be at this point, but I found that it poofed out into an unflattering balloony shape. I didn't want that, but I also didn't want to just take the excess fabric out of the pattern. I wanted the option that I could let it poof if I ever wanted to down the road. So instead, I stitched down the back pleats from the waistline to the bottom edge of the lining. Next up is the bloomers. This I was a little nervous for, as up until now I had never attempted any type of bifurcated garment. And as a side note, the word bifurcated is so cool. I only heard the word for the first time a few months ago when Bernadette was talking about Victorian #secret pants, and it's one of those random words that makes my echolalia very happy. Bifurcated. Bifurcated. Brains are weird. And moving on. We ended the bodice with pleating, and we start the bloomers with pleating. Why the one side of the bloomers is cut on a zigzag to be pleated, I do not know, but once it's pleated properly, it all sits as a nice straight line. The pleats get stitched down to hold them in place. And yes, I'm taking great care to not sew on top of my pins here. Then the individual legs can get pinned together and sewn up, along the long edge and short curved edge. Then one leg gets turned right side out and put inside the other leg. Then the legs get sewn together, almost but not quite all the way along the seam line. The bloomers and bodice get pinned together, matching up center back, side seams, and front openings. This is done wrong sides together so that the raw seams will be on the outside, which just feels wrong, but does make sense down the line. Then it gets sewn together, and I decided to use my modern machine for this step since the pleats were a bit bulky, and that's the one thing my workhorse of an antique machine has a bit of a challenge with. The bodice waistband gets turned and pressed under 1/2 inch on both long sides. Then it gets pinned onto the right side of the romper, over top of the waist seam to cover the raw edges. See? I told you it would make sense. One thing I love about this twill fabric is how nicely it takes to pressing and how sharp the lines end up. It then gets edge stitched down. This project taught me that edge stitching is basically the same thing as top stitching, just closer to the edge. The foot on my antique machine made it really easy to get that nice, tight, super close stitching in a way I don't think my modern machine could. The long side of the front facing gets pressed under, and then the whole facing gets pinned to the right side of the romper and stitched down. It then gets turned to the wrong side and pressed to hold the crisp edge, and both long edges get edge stitched to hold in place. The front placket gets pressed in the same way, folded in half lengthwise, and the short edges get stitched down. Then the short edges get turned right side out, pressed, and sewn to the right hand side of the romper. It then gets turned under to the wrong side and edge stitched along both long edges to secure it in place. The bottom edge of the placket gets matched up with the bottom of the facing, and they are edge stitched together. This was admittedly fiddly, and I did not like this part. It was so fiddly that I didn't film the sewing part. So here's what it looks like when it's sewn together as it should be. Next up is the collar. Any trim gets added on before putting the pieces together, and I'm using this 1/4 inch twill tape for the trim. There are loads of configurations of trim seen on these bathing costumes, but they all tend to feature at least some amount of piping or contrasting trim, usually white. For precise planning, I decided to take a page from Screen rather than the history books, and so I went with an homage to Julia Ogden in the Murdoch Mysteries episode Loch Ness Murdoch. I marked out the recommended start points for the trim so I had some guide to go by, and did a quick mark of the seam allowance on the outer edges. Then I spent some time playing around with the trim to find the exact configuration I wanted. I wasn't sure at first if I wanted all 3 rows or if 2 would be enough. I did end up sticking with the 3 rows. Once I was happy with the overall layout, I marked how far from the seam allowance I wanted the first row to start. This is a place where you really want to make sure the trim is even and straight. I also tried doing a zigzag stitch because I thought it would hold the trim better, but I hated the way it looked, so I went with a standard straight stitch all the way along. I gave the collar a gentle press in between each row of trim to help keep things crisp and even out any slight ripples. Once the first row was down, I did the other 2 rows totally by eye, keeping the bit of dark in between the rows at an even distance. There was a lot of pausing to readjust, and I made sure to keep the tension even on both sides of the fabric to prevent any puckering. A quick press to make everything smooth and crisp, and the 2 collar pieces can be stitched together. The seam allowances get trimmed down, as well as the sharp corners. The collar then gets turned right side out, and I used quilting clips to help hold the seam down properly while I got it ready to iron. The inner curved edges get stay stitched to hold the shape of the curve, and the seam allowance on the curve gets clipped. And then the collar gets pinned to the romper and stitched down. The neck facing gets sewn together at the center and the outer edges turned under, and then it's pinned to the right side of the collar. The facing is stitched down and then turned inside and edge stitched in place, taking care not to catch the collar. Then it was time to start tackling the sleeves. The straight edges get folded under twice and edge stitched to make a narrow hem. A row of bias tape gets sewn on the wrong side of the fabric to house the elastic. The bias tape should be sewn as close to the edges as possible so there's room for the elastic to go through. Then the curved edge at the top of the sleeve gets gathering stitches put in. I remember seeing Morgan Donner do a trick one time where she used 2 needles at once to do both sets of gathering stitches, so I wanted to try that here. It did not go well. I don't know if I just need more practice or if I was holding the needles wrong, but either way, it went much faster when I went back to just doing one row and then the other like I normally do. The pattern helpfully comes with a guide for cutting the elastic based on the size you're using. I'm not a fan of tight elastic around my biceps, so I cut it ever so slightly longer than the guide. Then I use the age-old trick of threading the elastic through with a safety pin. Works every time. The short side of the sleeves get pinned together, making sure the elastic is secured on both sides. When I reached the elastic, I went super slowly, both to make sure everything stayed in place, but also because you do have to sew over your pins at this point, and I didn't want to break a needle. Just one gentle little hand crank at a time. Only once both sides of the elastic were securely stitched down did I take out the pin holding it in place. At this point, all that was left to do with the sleeves was put them in. It was at this point that I got scared because sleeves are scary, and I jumped over to working on the detachable skirt instead. The back seam is a little tricky as it basically has plackets built into the pattern pieces, and you have to remember to fold everything the right way. The back seam gets sewn together first, and then you do the finicky things with the plackets. This is why we keep instructions handy at all times. And although it looks like I know what I'm doing here, I really don't, and I had to seam rip the left side placket and redo it to make it actually sit the way it's supposed to. Basically, one side is supposed to be wider than the other, so they overlap. So what I did here, don't do that. Then the back panels get pleated toward the center back. There are helpful markings on the pattern pieces that show theoretically how wide the pleats should be, but mine ended up too wide at the waist. So I made narrower pleats and winged it to end up with a waist measurement I was happy with. Once I was happy with the waist measurement, I stitched down the pleats to hold them in place. The buttonhole placket was challenging to understand at first, but once it's actually part of the garment, it makes perfect sense. It's essentially half of a waistband that sits behind the proper waistband, so the buttons that hold the skirt on aren't noticeable when the skirt is being worn. Once it's folded in half, the buttonholes get made. Since these buttonholes are on the inside and will almost never be seen, I didn't worry about a fancy buttonhole stitch, but did a strong but simple whip stitch all the way around. The placket gets matched up with the center of the waistband and stitched down. I didn't understand the point of sewing it this way until I was actually sewing it, and then I appreciated the reasoning. It's actually a quick and effective way of stitching the placket down that holds it firmly in place while keeping the buttonholes easily accessible, and also looks pretty. Once the placket is secured, the waistband halves get sewn together on 3 sides, then sewn to the skirt. Then it's folded over, and the waistband is edge-stitched all the way around both top and bottom. This helps hold everything in place, but also keeps the waistband looking smooth and not bunchy. The end is nigh. Well, almost. For a true historical look, there is an inset, which is most often in a contrasting color. I needed something white that would be stiff enough to hold up alongside the twill, so I used a bit of leftover Coutil from when I made Regency short stays using red threaded kit. Again, I was going for a Julia Ogden-inspired look, so I ignored the suggestions on the pattern and went with my own design. I marked out the seam allowance all the way around, and since I didn't have any suitable ribbon, I used some thin navy bias tape. I played around with the layout of the tape, using screenshots as a guide. Once all the pieces were in place, I stitched them down by hand. This was partially because I wanted a bit of relaxing hand sewing, and partially because I had just run out of thread on my bobbin and couldn't be bothered to rethread it. I had left the lengths of tape longer in case there was any shifting or puckering that needed adjusting while I stitched. Once all the lengths were sewn down securely, I was able to trim them off to be parallel with the fabric. The two inset panels get pinned together, and once again, instead of machine sewing, I chose to do this step by hand. Could I have whipped this through my modern machine and had it done in 2 minutes? Yes, I could have, but I needed something relaxing to do. Then I started flipping the inset right side out, and only remembered when I was 90% through that you're supposed to trim the seam allowances to reduce bulk. Coutil is super stiff, which is very good for certain garments. However, it is a pain to flip right side out, and I ended up using a pair of pliers to grab and pull. It gets a good press to make it sit nice and flat, and then edge stitched around the 3 straight edges. It then gets sewn to the edge of the bodice from the underside. Now that I could not procrastinate any further, I returned to the sleeves. The flat sections get pinned on, matching sleeve seams to bodice seams, and the excess sleeve fabric gets gathered into the remaining space of the armscye. There is a lot of zhuzhing to get the gathers evenly spread out, and a lot of pinning to get them to stay in place. Traditionally, sleeves were sewn by hand, since it is easier and more precise than wrangling them by machine. I used back stitches all the way around, since that is the most secure stitch. I didn't want to risk the fabric fraying around the armscye, so I did a quick binding with bias tape to enclose the raw edges. This is not included on the pattern, but if you're not serging your fabric, it would be a quick, easy way to finish off the sleeves. To finish off the bloomer-like cuffs, the raw edges get turned onto twice and edge stitched down. The skirt hem also gets finished off in the exact same way. Elastic is measured out using the included guide, and then, just like with the sleeves, I threaded it through using a safety pin and secured both ends with strong whip stitches. There are also 2 ties that are mostly decorative, and I decided to sew them by hand as well because reasons. Logic was not necessarily my strong suit during this project. And no, the irony of me wearing a shawl to finish my bathing costume because the weather was chilly was not lost on me at all. The pliers are turned once again to help turn the ties right side out, and then the ties get stitched down, the ends hidden under the collar. Now that the romper is almost done, we can finish up the details on the skirt. Julia's skirt has 2 sets of 3 rows of white trim, so that's what I aimed for as well. I started by marking 3 inches up from the hem and using that as a start point. Then I ran a line of trim all around the skirt. I thought about pinning each layer in place, but it would have affected the way it sat on the fabric, and ultimately it was easier to line up the trim by hand and eye. And then I did the same with the next 2 rows. After the first set, I marked the next set to start 2 inches above instead of 3. One of the things I found most important about sewing on the trim was to keep even tension on the fabric when it was going through the machine. If there was uneven tension on either side, it would start to pucker. And then, all that was left was lots of buttons and buttonholes. There are buttons that go all the way up the front, buttonholes on the skirt, and extra buttons to hold the skirt to the romper, plus a couple of buttons to hold the contrasting inset piece in place. And I found that as long as you're very careful not to cut too far, a seam ripper actually does a pretty decent job at cutting buttonholes exactly where you want. Once the center buttonholes were in place, I went along and carefully marked where the buttons would go on the other side. The buttons got sewn on with strong silk thread. Normally silk doesn't do well in the water, but that mostly means it will lose its shine, not that water will damage the structural integrity of the thread. The pattern calls for one button to be sewn to the center back, and then it gets an extra long shank so that both layers of skirt can button onto the same button. I found this layout actually kind of uncomfortable, so I switched to a pair of buttons, and this made putting the skirt on and off so much easier. The inset also gets a pair of buttons to hold it in place, otherwise it would go absolutely everywhere. And with that, my Victorian bathing costume is complete. I love how it turned out. Absolutely cute, super comfy, and really easy to move around in, both out of and in the water. I'm not saying I want to go swimming laps while wearing it, although I did have to tread water while wearing street clothes for my bronze levels and lifeguard training, and that's not that different. But it is really nice for at the beach. As someone who struggles with self-confidence about how they look and doesn't necessarily want to show off every lump and bump to the world, this gives me so much more of a confidence boost than a bikini ever would. So as the sun sets on summer, let's go for one last splash in the lake. I want to give a big thanks to everyone who watches my videos and subscribes. Thanks to you guys, this channel just crossed the 1,000 subscriber threshold. Reaching that milestone has really encouraged me and inspires me to get out and make more stuff. If you like this video and geekery meets history sewing adventures are your jam, please consider hitting the subscribe button, and I will see you all in my next video.